do-over.
I'm serious. Lessons learned from experience, right? You get into the situation where you're like, oh yeah, okay, don't do that again.
Brian, I don't necessarily have a preference, but I know that one, like with the pharmaceutical use case, there was the use of paper processes that kind of allowed them to operate the cyber incident and recover with kind of little to no downtime, customer facing wise. And then you've got the IT service provider that had to go through some more extensive, forensic analysis, 40 hours of forensics before we actually did the recovery from a backdated backup. And then another, 8 hours for validation after that. Do you have a preference or thought on which one would be more interesting to chat about
Both,
conceptually?
yeah, they're both interesting in different ways. So the one side is looking at, the idea of it's more than just an IT problem. So there's different ways we can get around it through business continuity, other manual processes, leveraging other ways of doing things. Versus the other one is more getting into the idea of we can't just, expect a simple DR type recovery where we just push things back out, we're back up and running very quickly. They're both kind of interesting in different ways. The technology one more, the IT company more on the technology perspective of some of those gotchas that a lot of companies miss as far as the expectation for recovery from a cyber event. So potentially that could be a good one for awareness purposes, because even on the business side, there's always that wrong expectation of, okay, we have an RTO and RPO, so we're going to hit that no matter what. And in
Yeah.
the cyber scenario, it's kind of out the window. Even for those technologies that, kind of say, you're still going to hit it, there's still other pieces that would kind of add on to that timeline.
Yeah. And Max, I'll throw this one back to you there's a tiny bit of crossover, but most of the cases we're going to be collaborating with a DFIR firm. It's 40 hours of digital forensics. We're not actually doing that part, but we're working with them versus paper processes, helping them recover on the back end while, helping them write policies and whatever to operate while they're down, that kind of thing. I don't know if that matters to you. I think either way, the conversation could be going down the path of the elements of a cyber recovery that may be different or
Yeah.
in disaster recovery.
I mean, look, the reason why I asked you is because I'm relatively agnostic to this.
Mac, I think let's go with the IT service provider because we can get into the kind of the business continuity conversation there as well. Other things they can do while we're waiting for that system to get back up and running with that extended down.
Let's start at the top then. So, Mac, Brian, we're talking about cybersecurity incident and response and really what the impact of it is. So let's unwind all the way back and talk about customer profile for a moment. We don't have to get into, actually, if you want to share the name, you can, but if you can't, that's totally fine. But give me some background. Like, what is the company? What industry are they in? What's the vertical size, geography? What kind of profile? So let's start with a profile and then work from there.
Yeah, I mean, this particular customer, IT service provider, more of like supplementary IT services to other organizations that need to gap fill. Think of help desk, patching, those kind of things. About $2 billion in revenue, so a relatively large IT service provider who, in this particular case, was impacted by a cyber incident.
In this case, the company is deriving their revenue from delivering IT services to other people.
Yeah.
And so IT is not a secondary function for them. This is actually a
Core.
primary function that's driving revenue. Okay, that's an interesting little tidbit we'll come back to in a little bit.
Mm.
Cyber incidents, I think the problem that I have, and one of the issues I get into with cyber conversations is we're ending up with like infinite acronyms. Every day there's a new acronym that gets thrown and like the acronyms are being redefined as time passes. So when you say cyber incident, what actually happened?
Yeah, it's a catch-all. In this particular case, it was ransomware. But I'll throw this over to Brian though too, because Brian does a lot more on the planning and preparation side for our customers. And there's many different types of incidents that he's planning for kind of on a day-to-day basis. You want to give kind of high level, maybe top 3, Brian?
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of a big picture. When we look at one of the things we find is that when we get into the whole cyber resilience conversation, it's really good to be clear what we mean when we start with that. So there's a lot of organizations when you say that they're thinking security. There's other ones you say that they're thinking recovery. Really, our view of it's really both. You have to have the preventive measures in place, the think security, as well as the reactive response recovery. So with that, you really want to be thinking about the different types of things that could hit you. So in this case, we talk about the idea of ransomware, malware. Think along the lines of the cases of data destruction that could also happen via insider threat. There's other things we need to plan for as well, the things like breach, data release, other things like that we are considering. Perspective of what we're talking about today, it's more around that data destruction or data unavailability type scenario, which the biggest one we hear about now is ransomware. So there's pieces we need to make sure we have in place to both prevent getting into one of those situations as well as enabling ourselves to be able to recover, effectively respond and recover if we do get into that.
I think it stands for years has released their top 10 list. And a couple decades ago, we talk about intentional act, inside actor, external actor, accidental act, inside actor. But if you really read through this thing now, it's all people driven, right? Did somebody do something intentionally? Did they get tricked into doing something? Did something unintentionally happen? And I really hate this framing because it just turns into like this idea of like you're constantly fighting against your own users to try to prevent them from doing something wrong or from getting tricked into doing something wrong and then like launching something bad. And I think that it's an unfortunate level of like us versus them mentality that comes out of that world, right? It's like we're all on the same team. I'm just trying to help you do your job and not have something bad happen to you at the same time. And the sophistication of the threat actors is getting ridiculous. There's some stuff right now. I get texts every other day about toll tags are up. And if you look at the actual text, it's very obvious that a UK phone number is probably not actually a valid, but people fall for this stuff. You get the wrong time in the wrong place and things happen. And what I want to actually talk about, because Brian, you hit on this a little bit, is this idea, and I put it almost into this idea of like offensive versus defensive security posture, and how do you approach that, right? So from an insurance mandate, insurance companies want you to have security awareness training. They want you to have an email gateway. They want you to have an endpoint detection response system. And a lot of these things become, is this defensively classified or is it offensively classified? Are you proactively trying to protect stuff, or are you reactively trying to identify and recover? And how do companies, as they're allocating budget, make a decision of like, where do they go?
Really interesting question. So that's actually a lot of what we've been digging into over the past couple of years at 1111. So the way we've tried to lay things out, it's a big problem. There's a lot of pieces, which is really the challenge around it. There's so many different pieces. So we talked a little while ago about the idea of breaking things into kind of the idea of preventive versus reactive controls. But within the preventive, which the items you just talked about would hit on, the way we do it is we break it into really four main areas. So we have our offensive security, so trying to poke holes, see where potentially we have issues, pen tests, vulnerability scans. We have the cyber hygiene. So you talked about the people element. That's usually our weakest link within the organization. How the threat actors gain access, training and awareness, phishing campaigns, just helping our organization have kind of a security first culture. So when we see something like that text come in for the unpaid tolls, we know that looks a little strange. Maybe let's not click the link right away. Let's dig in a little bit or do a little bit of background on this. We have the threat intelligence pillar that we look at. So awareness of what are the types of threats we may face. Have we already maybe been a target? Do we have data out on the dark web already? So awareness of the things we should be looking for. Are we a high value target for threat actors? And then the other piece, the defensive security. So all those different pieces that we have in place to try to prevent the access to, safeguard and stop them from gaining access to our environment. So that's kind of the way we try to organize things. So again, it's a lot. It can be overwhelming. So we try to put it into these pillars to try to look at things and make sure we're kind of balanced. The other side, I think you talked about, Max, is the budgeting piece. Really difficult right now for organizations to really understand, okay, I have a set budget. I only have so many dollars. We already talked about, there's the preventive and reactive. Where do I spend my money? So really you have to find balance. One of the ways we're starting to actually start to look at things within our organization and service offering is quantifying cyber risk. So the way we're actually doing that is we're leveraging a tool that it's pretty sophisticated in what it does, in that it's leveraging historical insurance claims. So an insurance claim database, over 250,000 claims within it. It ties that then to your company profile. So I'm this type of company within this industry. I'm this size. I'm located in this area. What it then can do is it can go through those claims and find, okay, for companies like you, this is what we've seen. These types of cyber threats, and this is what it looks like as far as a dollar amount. The flip side is also an understanding of the controls. So if we make an investment, there's mapping that's done to MITRE ATT&CK to understand really what potentially that will prevent or mitigate. So with that, there's basically a value that can be assigned to that. So with this, organizations now can justify budgets. So we can say, okay, if we spend X thousands of dollars, we can mitigate X millions of dollars of cyber risk. So again, it's that sophistication, trying to build out our capabilities, have a better understanding of, we know the threat actors are constantly evolving. We need to really understand, how do we put ourselves in a better position? Where do we get the most value for our dollar? So that's kind of an effort we're making internally, and a lot of organizations are looking to do the same.
It's an interesting game of whack-a-mole to a
It
certain
is.
degree, right? So For a long time, I've heard cybersecurity references as insurance policy or positioned almost as insurance, but it's not insurance. Insurance, when your house burns down, insurance is what you go to get money to rebuild the house. And in that kind of example, cybersecurity is like, do you have a lock on your front door? Do you actually lock the front door? Do you have an alarm system? Does an alarm system work? Does it actually tell somebody that something's going on in your house, right? Like you're talking about limiting damage and what your damage could be. And my experience has been talking with clients. You can really tell the people that have been through an event before, right? And whether it's data loss or some sort of intrusion or whatever it is. And I kind of classify that in terms of any sort of risk event. If you've had in the last 20 years, if you had some sort of data loss event, then you think about things in frame of that. Like I went through this horrible experience and like, how do I avoid this horrible experience again? But that's not like when we start talking about like quantifying risk against a potential insurance claim and dollars for that insurance claim. I mean, this is a really good tool for an insurance company to use to then say, you fit this profile and your premium should actually be X because you're more risky and we think we're going to have a higher probability of a loss event for you. But how much does that actually drive outcomes for the company, for the end user that's actually in market saying, oh, you have a risk score of like 8, right? Or whatever like the gauge is. And like, oh my goodness, we got to do X, Y, and Z because they're still, without that experience, it's hard to understand this is why you need an EDR, and this is why you need threat intelligence, and this is why you need a SIM, and this is why you need a secure web gateway, and this is why you want. And like you get into this acronym soup issue again of things.
Yeah, so I think that you make a good point there. So again, I think you have to really kind of take a step back and try to organize things. So I mentioned, the idea of our cyber resilience pillars. The way we are looking at it as far as doing a risk assessment for cyber. So the quantitative is great for making your case to the board or executive leadership. I need budget because we're facing this real threat, and this translates to X millions of dollars. Not my opinion, based off insurance claims. So if we do nothing today, we have this inherent risk that we're facing. So if it's $300 million of inherent risk, if we do nothing, if someone decides to attack us, that's what we're looking at as a potential outcome that, we're going to have to incur these financial losses. We are going to have to pay ransom. All these different things add up. So we try to give kind of a couple different ways you want to look at it. So there's that quantitative view, which is helpful for making your case for budgeting. But you also have to understand from almost a qualitative view of things where potentially those gaps are. So think red, yellow, green. So if I lay out the pillars, I could say, okay, we're looking for these types of controls within these pillars, and we're really strong in defensive security. We're doing pretty good in offensive security, but we get into things like our actual offline backups or our incident recovery. We're a little bit weak. We're relying on our traditional DR, which is really a gamble because we know, okay, if they got to our backup, we're hoping we can find one that's old enough that they didn't touch because we didn't have immutable copies or we didn't have them air gapped. So you have to kind of look at it different ways. So quantitative, great for making your case for budgeting, but more of a qualitative to understand really where some of those gaps are. We've completely ignored the incident recovery piece. We see that a lot when we deal with organizations. They'll talk about, we think we're in a great place for cyber resilience. And then we'll do an assessment on them and we'll find out for preventive controls, you are doing a great job. When we get to the recovery side, you're treating it as a single checkbox. And unfortunately, it's not that simple. Mm-hmm. So we tend to find gaps that way. And then it becomes more awareness. These are the types of things you really should be looking to do to really reduce that risk, reduce those gaps and vulnerabilities that exist within your organization right now.
You bring up something that's interesting. Ultimately, you're talking about executives going through budgeting cycles, usually a board going through evaluation and budgeting cycles, right? So you start talking about things in terms of fiduciary responsibilities. I spent a good majority of my career in Southern California. So our DR planning was always around like the 10.0 earthquake was going to hit and take out all of, the West Coast. And what I didn't understand as a young IT guy going through this was the exercise was creating enough information to give to the board for them to make a decision. And that was the fiduciary responsibility. Like, oh, we have this inherent risk, which, could in theory cripple this business, which is this much revenue and this many jobs. And it would cost, Y to prevent that or recover from it. And, we've decided that the risk, even as severe as it is, isn't worth the expense of mitigating the risk. And so we've checked the box, and every year we'd have to do this exercise. Or when I was consulting, we do this for multiple companies every year. And it was always like this whole thing of like, oh, here we go again. Like how many hours of my life am I going to have to waste, creating some DR plan that I know is never going to be used. But it's that idea has carried through into cyber. And whether that's risk from backups and not having backups from cyber incidents is of, where does that line really come in of we've done our fiduciary duty and we've evaluated it and we've decided that even though the risk is perceptionally high, we're not a target, people like to say, right? Or it's not worth the expense for us to go farther than what we've done.
Yeah, so I think there's different approaches you can take to try to make it more manageable. So one of the things we highly recommend is really to evaluate your data. Not all data is equal within an organization. So the pictures from the company kickoff party are very nice to have, but they're not must. It's not must-have data. So one of the things we recommend as far as really enabling your recovery capabilities is the very first understand your data, assess it. What is the must-have data within the organization? We like to use the term vital data assets. So think about, the data where if we lost that, it's potentially going to put us out of business. Think of an insurance company, if they lost all their policies, what do they do at that point? So really understanding the data, what's the most valuable data within your organization, which would primarily be the primary target of a threat actor. They're going to try to figure out what's going to cause you the most pain. Then understanding also, what does that look like as far as interdependencies, upstream, downstream? Is this a single source of the data? Can potentially I rebuild from other systems or recreate from reports? How much of this can I piece together? So you start to get a better feel. I'll give an example. We did a large global retailer. They had over 3,000 applications. They said, while we'd love to protect everything, clearly our budget will not allow us to protect everything. So they went through this assessment with us. On their own, they were able to, eliminate 2,000 applications right off the bat. We know these are just nice to have. Went away. It's not going to stop the business. But then you get into, that smaller list, which is still too much. So at that point, how do we narrow that down? So what we did with them is we went through and assessed and understood, okay, what's the value of this data? What if I told you, you lost the last 6 months of data from this application? What would that mean to the organization? Is this catastrophic? It's going to be, just a nuisance. So you try to, identify that way, then get into the conversation about, is it single source, our ability to rebuild, recreate. So again, you're able to narrow it in. Then the other consideration would be, we know that application B is going to be the primary target for the threat actors. Do you want to protect the whole process? So I need application A data to feed in and it feeds down to application C. Do you protect the process, or you just focus in on the individual target? If you do that, you have to recognize, okay, we're trying to minimize the spend there, but it's going to be more difficult on the back end. It's going to require cleanup. We're going to have systems out of sync. We're going to have ghost transactions. It's going to require work, which then will extend the timeline before we're fully back in a position where we could say, okay, we're back to how we were before we had this event, before this incident occurred. So there's ways you can try to have an effective approach where, again, can't protect everything, but let's at least protect the items that we can, that we know would cause us the most pain. To think of it almost in the terms of what will allow us to survive. What do we need to survive? Minimal acceptable requirements to keep the business moving. So that way you can focus in, reduce the spend, and really make effective spend on the items that you are protecting.
You mentioned immutable backups earlier. Our friends at Verizon publish a DBIR every year. Okay. And it's always an interesting read, and it's terrifying at the same time. And a few years ago, dwell time, was pushing up at like a year, which is terrifying to think that, you had a threat actor in your environment for a year before launching or doing something or being detected. And dwell time is being pushed down, and, which is also terrifying, right? Like, so now you're talking about a threat actor getting into your environment and launching an attack or doing something destructive almost immediately. And I don't know which one I'd actually prefer in those cases, right? Like, it's, you're like, which one's better? I don't know. But the immutable backups are interesting because you get into this whole thing. At what point does a business get big enough that this conversation becomes serious for them? There's revenue, employee count, risk profile. Like, companies go through evolutions of growth, and then the idea of resiliency changes for them, because if you're a 50-person SMB that's scaling, right, like the idea of having a risk and a compliance officer probably doesn't exist for you unless you're dealing with, some sort of heavily regulated industry as a client. But when you're 1,000 employees, 2,000 employees, 5,000 employees, the organization, what it has to deal with changes significantly in that span of time. And is it better to be larger, or is it better to be smaller, in those lines?
I have some feedback there, but one thing that I did want to draw attention to, I failed to mention earlier, would be, and we see this over and over again, is the impact of mergers and acquisitions. So one big challenge with this IT services company is they're continuing to buy other IT service providers to roll in, and not all of those acquired were really brought up to the go forward standard of the organization, which is ultimately where the bad actor got in. Is, you know, lower requirements on the endpoints. You know, someone clicks on something, it follows its way through. But this is we see this universally, even beyond this one, is the more M&A, the more complex and siloed some of these environments are, and there's not a lot of oversight until they're integrated properly into the, you know, go forward plan. But you got all this legacy stuff and tech debt sitting out here that's just taking time to weed through, and oftentimes that is the vulnerability, I guess, opens the door.
Mac, doesn't that drive a misconception though? Because there's a lot of people that still believe that I'm not a target, or I have valuable, I'm a valuable target. If you're a financial services company, of course, like people are going to be after you all day long because they know you have more financial asset, money sitting somewhere than others, right?
Yeah.
If you're involved in crypto, right, it's an easy transaction to go attack and suck a lot of money out of. But outside of government, defense, and financial services, like the rest of the world, we're not talking about like an explicitly targeted attack for most of them.
Yeah.
I mean, you have like corporate espionage, kind of activities, but that's a different category. And what you're talking about with mergers, with the M&A activity, it's just kind of like if you're connected to the internet and you have a soft point, it'll be found. Not because it was even like intentionally being looked for. It's just eventually it's going to be found because it's connected to the internet.
Right. Port scanning. They're looking indiscriminately and sending out email campaigns indiscriminately. It's who we can get. It's a numbers game. I think the profile of the attacker changes, right? If you're a nation state, you're going to attack strategic targets. If you are someone looking to cash in because I bought some code or package off the dark web, they may not even know what they're doing, but they're looking for somewhere to plant this to pull some potential revenue out, and they can automate a lot of that. So targeting is, I think that hopefully that myth is dispelled relatively quickly, because it's not necessarily even evaluating the target. They're waiting for someone to initiate or click on something so they can respond and get what they can.
I mean, you keep saying targeting, so I'm going to bring up Target. Target was exploited because they're HVAC contractor. Was the HVAC contractor there was a targeted attack of like, hey, let's go, break into an HVAC company that's providing facilities services, and then go figure out who they have. I mean, if that was a targeted attack, that's like a really, like, somebody like really whiteboarded that out pretty intensely in order to be able, like, hey, let's go penetrate all these different HVAC companies and find the one that has unrestricted access into like a giant retailer to go do credit card skimming on.
CDK was a little bit more recent, where you got a application provider, so that's doing some IT managed services over the top for car dealerships. I mean, they got taken down for about 30,000 dealerships couldn't sell a car for 8 days or more. And the rolling out of repair and back to business took quite a bit longer than that. That was over $1 billion in damage in just the auto industry.
Okay, so in that scenario, right, you have a SaaS company that's providing a service to the end user, right? So the SaaS company is damaged with that outage, and then the end user is damaged with that outage, right? And that end user, in this case, a car dealership, the level of sophistication that, unless you're a large mega group, you're actually going through and looking at supply chain risk going up the stack of what you're actually doing. How many of those 30,000 car dealerships do you think had actually evaluated, hey, we have a critical platform here, and is that critical platform goes offline, like, what does that mean for us? Or do you think that this was just like oh, whoops, we can't sell cars for 8 days and we don't know when and if we'll be able to do it again, as a response?
Yeah, I mean, for us, third-party risk assessments, upmarket have been pretty standard for some period of time. I think that that importance is driving down market, but the more that, like, the SMB space goes to SaaS applications, that specific niche of a third-party risk assessment on your SaaS company is going, especially if that's your most critical application, are going to be more important. So the SaaS providers who may not fall into a regulated category are starting to get quasi-regulated by their end users, because they're being asked questions maybe they haven't had to answer before, like, how do you manage through and recover from a cyber-related incident? What preventative measures are you taking, to protect my data and continue to operate even if something were to happen? Those kind of questions, I wouldn't say are being asked for the first time, but they're being asked more often by smaller organizations because they're dependent on that SaaS player.
I mean, in the B2B space in SaaS, this gets expressed most commonly with SOC 2. Like, are you SOC 2 compliant? And there's a lot of subjectivity in the SOC 2 process I've experienced.
Submit your own controls. Yeah.
Yeah. And is it good that we now have a like some level of conformity that people are going through and actually asking for? Probably. I mean, it's better than nothing, but like, is it creating an outcome that gives people like, are we actually moving the ball forward, or if we just created like another obstacle on the field
or another industry? Brian, did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's an interesting topic. The SaaS, there's been a lot of misconceptions about SaaS from, right from the beginning, where, everyone kind of assumed we just transfer all the risk onto the SaaS provider. And, we're finding that's not the case. I think, organizations are starting to realize, okay, we still own some of the risk. The data is our data. So, again, from the consulting perspective, one of the things we started doing was taking a look at SaaS recovery assessments. So a lot of organizations, when they do that third-party risk assessment, they're looking, are they doing security controls? But they don't really dig into the recovery side of things. Which scenarios are we actually covered for? Single site loss, regional loss, cyber. And I can tell you from the ones we've done, we found 90+% of the SaaS organizations are saying, if it's a cyber event, it's your problem. Your data, your problem, will recover. If that data is compromised, that's not our problem. You own that data. So the flip side of it also then is understanding what you as an organization are doing to try to protect yourself. Are there things we can do? Can we do backups of the data? So a lot of times the answer is not directly. So you have to get creative, via APIs, things like that.
Yeah,
Leveraging business continuity, that idea of rebuild, recreate, it's a whole mess in itself. And a lot of organizations just aren't realizing that cyber one is not one that the SaaS organizations want to take on.
I mean, this leads me to my other favorite conversation with like Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace of like, oh, it's there, it's safe. And it's like, you do understand that delete is a valid operation as far as both of those providers are concerned. Like if somebody deletes everything, like that's a valid like operation, deleting data. I had two events. I had one really early in my career, and they had data loss. It was their ERP platform, and we were brought in to try to help them recover it and then rebuild infrastructure afterwards. And in this case, that company went to paper and had a conference room full of temps that was just transcribing paper to regenerate their ERP. And it was to actually like walk into a room and see, a lot of people, I mean, 20, 30 people sitting in a room with temporary desks and just, a stack of paper and just re-entering transactions into it. I mean, it's like that was like really, I mean, what else? The hospital group on the East Coast that had National Guard on site, like in fatigues, like helping them re-image computers, like on the news. And you see that and you're like, this stuff, like it's not theoretical. Like it really, the remediation, the recovery from it is a lot more involved. I think, Brian, you started talking about this a little bit. We should actually probably dig into I mean, I like the sound, the tangent here, but I want to get to this case study. Okay. So IT services provider providing IT. So an IT organization, so core service has a ransomware attack. And this came from, I think, Mac, that you said that it came from an acquisition that just wasn't up to date with everything else. And they had a soft target, a soft spot, and somebody got into their network. Did they actually ever do investigation to understand like dwell time as part of their recovery? I mean, actually, let me do this different way. I'm going to think about this differently. Walk me through the event in their eyes. Like, what happens? Like, you kind of come into the office one morning, you're making a cup of coffee, or you've just gone home to, hang out with your kids and go to a baseball game. Like, walk me through the event and what the actual company experiences as the event unfolds.
In this particular case, and I'll kind of segment because there is a line between where we get involved from a cyber incident recovery standpoint and where a digital forensics incident recovery provider or incident response provider gets involved. So oftentimes, we will be collaborative with that incident responder who's doing all the digital forensics, and we don't get all of the information necessarily as to all the validated elements that they're working through to recover or restore. We're kind of providing them, clean infrastructure, clean room, working with them to recover and or give them multiple copies so they can more quickly identify the most recent version of clean data, which would be maybe the bigger difference between like a traditional disaster recovery and a cyber recovery is not how fast can I turn on a replica, but how fast can I identify, and in this case was recovered from a historical backup, but to your point, not the old dwell time type scenario. We've also seen that trend where, Brian, you may know this better than me, but it's down to like 7 to 14 days at least on our side, of how far we've got to go back to find that clean data. Would you say that's accurate, Brian?
Yeah, it really varies. And if you look at different studies, they'll come up with different, time frames. But I think, the cases that we've run into, Mac, I think you're right. It's been shorter time frames, so we've been able to roll back to a fairly recent copy and recover that clean data from there.
So in your point, Mac, right? Like you're either in the IT organization or you're not. You're,
Yeah.
an executive, whatever it is. And you're going to get a phone call, and phone call is going to be like, something's going on,
Yeah.
and we don't know what it is. And then you start trying to investigate what's going on. Then you realize your systems are encrypted. You've lost access to things, whatever. Like the world has just become a very scary place for you. And a lot of times it's probably because you just don't have information at that point. I mean, Colonial Pipeline was quoted in the Wall Street Journal after they paid the ransom. And the quote was, we didn't know how bad it was. Like
Yeah.
they couldn't make a determination of what to actually do because they couldn't quantify the risk and what the process for recovery was going to be for them. And so in that world, it was just, they made the decision to pay a ransom because that was at least, like a hard line. But so you're on the receiving end of this, and all of a sudden, like systems just start going offline, data becomes unavailable to you. It's like this cascading thing, right? Like it just gets worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
What I've had conversations with people where it's like they want to know everything that's happened from point A to point B of like, what do they actually get in and what do they actually do? And you start talking about like this forensics and incident response that comes into play. And like, how important actually is that outside of just trying to identify what was the source and time of the actual of intrusion?
Yeah.
And like, is this the line, like over here is bad and over here is good? And so we know where we have to go in order to do something. If you don't have an IR plan today and you're watching this, like what's like the critical next step for you in terms of like, oh, we think we have backups and maybe we test them and maybe we don't, but like,
Right.
what's the like bare minimum, like start putting this on paper and thinking about it.
Yeah. I mean, the steps in the most simplistic form would be, isolate, identify the ransomware variant, eradicate with forensics tools. That's all, restore, harden. That's kind of the playbook, but obviously the reality is much harder. If I rewind a little bit and look at what we're advising on, in most cases, so much of the response is done before anything happens. So Brian mentioned earlier with vital data assets and really trying to identify what's critical to the business to continue to operate, like what's revenue generating and determine their interdependencies. And that's a financial discussion, right? Is if I've got to do all or nothing, that's going to be a big spread. But the focal point is what's our vital data assets and what applications do we need to bring up, first to continue to operate and, build or collect revenue. Immutability becomes a big piece of that too, but there's issues in that if it's done incorrectly. And we run into this all the time, which again is another financial discussion, is if your immutable policies get out of whack or become forever, you can never delete any of that stuff. So you end up paying for a lot of storage you probably don't need. So again, that's more on the front end of doing it right and doing it well, having an air gapped or kind of clean room architecture. And there's a number of ways to do that, but having that available. And this is kind of where the incident recovery folks come into play, is if they do have that isolated environment with hopefully on-demand compute, or at least some level of compute resources where they can start to look at multiple copies without, reinfecting. That's kind of where we advise on the front end. And then you start getting into, validation. So testing and making sure, I'm sure you track the 32110, but kind of best practices historically were the 321, the three different versions of the data, 2 locations, 1 immutable or something like that.
1 offsite, yeah.
Yeah. So, but the additional 10, which are really the elements, that 0 specifically is validation, 0 errors. So the testing regularity becomes so much more critical in the cyber use case, because if a backup failed and the backup tool said it succeeded, that obviously is a little bit more impactful. So then you move into the incident playbooks. Again, that step-by-step guide for response. And this is where we kind of hand it off and even engage the incident responder. So that's response, containment, restoration while they're going through that process. In this particular use case that we're talking about, that's 40 hours worth of digital forensics that the incident responders had to do before we can even start the process of recovering into production, which in this case, their RPO was 16 hours. That was achieved. But then again, you still have step by step, every phase, you're slowly reintroducing applications into the environment, and you kind of watch your teams work and validate. That took another 8 hours after we brought the environment back up. So 72 hours was really the back to production, I guess, RTO in this scenario. But even after that, and you mentioned this before, they went for over 11 months and rebuilding this entire environment kind of into its new form. So it's very impactful, and the ransom is rarely the biggest expense in the process.
72 hours after a breach is a really fast recovery. I mean, this is
for 100 plus physical virtual machines. I mean, it was lightning.
Yeah. No, I mean, 72 hours is a really fast recovery from this. You're talking about an organization that, even though they had a squishy spot that somebody took advantage of, I mean, they had a lot of this already in place, right?
Mm-hmm.
They had backups, they had a plan, they had instant response, they probably already had an IR retainer, they already had a run book. This isn't like somebody that was completely caught off guard. I mean, you can't do a 72-hour recovery. Just getting somebody to show up on the door and start an incident response,
Mm-hmm.
if you don't already have that in place, like, who are you going to call, right? Like, it's not like you're calling 1-800 come save me, right? It's, you have to find a name and engage a name and contract with a name. And I don't want to take that away from anybody here. That's 72 hours is an excellent response. But you talk about like data validation on backups are really boring and a really like nobody wants to do it until you actually go, wait, we have to recover, and then it gets really exciting.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, even with that, Max, what we find is the pressure's on, the clock's running when you get into one of these situations. And like you said, this case study, obviously they had a lot of pieces already in place. They had it pretty well thought out. They knew the approach. They knew the steps to take. They had the right pieces in place to enable an effective recovery. The temptation for a lot of organizations that really haven't spent as much time or as much thought into the process is the clock's running. Let's get things back up and running quickly. They get so fixated on that RTO and RPO that they'll make the mistake of, let's just grab the most recent copy and let's push it back in production. And guess what? It's been, already infected. You now have compromised the environment again. Start over. The clock's running still. Okay, let's try this one. Push it back into production. Oh, same problem. We're now, reinfected the whole environment. So you just keep going through this process over and over, and the clock is just running and running and running. Versus, in the case study here, they took a very controlled approach and said, okay, look, we know it's going to take time to go through and do the forensics. We want to make sure that we have clean data. When we get that, what we think is the clean data, we're not just going to push it right back into production. We're going to use that clean room or isolated recovery environment. Let's make sure that it truly is clean. And then once we have a comfort level, then we can actually push that and start, leveraging that data. There's still going to be additional cleanup, like we talked about before, potentially, different point in time. There may be ghost transactions, there may be missing transactions, systems out of sync. So there's going to be cleanup work you have to do on the back end, but at least at that point, you're back up and running. We're processing new work. So again, I think the temptation is, people get so fixated by that RTO and wanting to hit it, which is great, but you have to kind of take a controlled approach to it and make sure that you don't just rush into things. The safest is probably not the quickest, I think, is the point here. You could do the quickest of just, grab the most recent, push it into production. But the end result is if you didn't get lucky and just happen to have a clean copy there, you're going to keep starting the process over and over, which is going to make the overall recovery time even longer than if you just taken the steps up front to do it the right way.
Isn't immutability an argument to go back a technology step, right? Like, so now everything is about object storage, online, cloud, which is great. I mean, because you get a lot of value out of that. But when you start talking about immutability and what people have to do in order to have immutability on these online cloud-based solutions, like, why not just go back to tape? Like, at some point, like, it's not sexy, but tapes are pretty immutable when you unplug them from a system and put them in like a box and store them offsite. Right?
The true air gap. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, are we going to see a trend back to tapes at some point here? I mean, like, I'm
not calling it or anything, but they kind of have. I mean, we've in some cases we compete against tape. I mean, we have a pretty great object storage story. And in some cases, the customers have elected to go back to tape. Obviously, buying, maintaining, you have to store them in a certain way, and particularly, in a vault. And, there's things you can do to make that cheaper. But then you've also got your Glacier Deep Archive, which is 99 cents a terabyte. Obviously, if you need to recover it, you're probably paying $400,000. But it's all trade-offs.
And probably on tape drive.
Yeah.
Something we haven't talked about at all, and I think this is probably important to get into, is in the recovery process, you actually talk about doing the recovery, right? So 1111 isn't doing, in this case, you're not doing the forensics and incident response in helping somebody go through and figure out, like, this is your clean data, but you're providing a lot of the rest of the solution for people, right? So where you're actually sending your backups to and how do you recover. And the time for recovery, like to download data and then put it into something, and then turn it on. And I don't care if you want to use like terminology like hydrate VMs or like whatever, fancy buzzword we actually want to. I think that process is also very surprising for people if they haven't been through a test yet of like how long it actually takes. If you're sending your data off to Glacier and then you want to download it from Glacier, right? Like how fast is your pipe to bring it down from Glacier? Like how long does it take for Glacier to actually put it into a state to be ready to download it? And then how long does it take you to download? And then how long does it take you to apply it? And how long does it take you to turn it on? Like these are other issues, right? And this has been your wheelhouse for a long time. And I mean, when I read like solution here and talking about like finding and identifying backdated backups, right? So the forensics and IR team is coming back and saying, okay, we've identified, we're pretty sure, here's the date. Like we want to go back to this date. At that point, what happens?
Yeah, so in theory, basically, what's happening is we're creating this clean room environment. Within that
What
clean
does
room,
that actually mean? Like, let's get like really
yeah,
nitpicky
so
here.
there's a couple different ways you could do it. So there's the idea, most ideal would be if you're going to do good, better, best. Best for a clean room would be a physically isolated environment, completely cut off from network. Access to that environment is controlled, restricted to only the ones that need access to it. A lot of organizations, if they don't have that space or that capability, just don't have this other recovery space just sitting out there in isolation, just waiting for one of these events to happen. They may do something, create an isolated recovery environment by segmenting the network. Think of it almost like a test bubble. So organizations that are doing the test bubble, keeping away from the production environment, then executing a recovery within that isolated environment. So then you can do some analysis and forensics on that to make sure that, okay, this data truly does look like it's clean. We're not seeing any of the indicators of compromise here. We're comfortable that at this point that the data is safe, where then it can then be pushed into either a DR environment. So if you think about traditional DR, we fell from site 1 to site 2, or the idea of pushing back to a production environment.
Now, are you doing this in conjunction with the customer and the customer's forensics and IR team? Is this the customer's doing this and the IR team is doing this? Because like you're talking about turning on an environment on your platform that then might be compromised with malware. That's not great for you either, right? How do you go through that process?
Yeah, so it's a collaborative effort. So we would be working with them for really leading on their team to identify where they think the clean data point is. And then we would help bring back those copies so we can create that clean room environment and then push the copies of the data to those 3 different points where then the team can kind of go through and do their forensics. So it's kind of both teams working together there. And then ultimately it's on the client to make the determination that, yeah, we're comfortable that this is good. Let's now push into, again, either the DR environment or a production environment if they have that comfort level based on where they want to push to.
And are people coming in I mean, is this all, how much of this is on-demand capacity and how much of this is pre-contracted capacity? I mean, how are you go through the process of figuring out, you've got 3,000 applications, you've decided you want to protect 100, we've gone through this process. I mean, is this stuff that people then are contracting for and saying, hey, we're going to have this 100 applications worth of capacity ready to go? Or is it just, oh, shoot, push the button, alert, emergency, activate, call Batman and get this thing going?
Yeah.
It's a combination.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's really, ideally you want to have this all laid out ahead of time. If you do get into the situation, you haven't really done the preparation or, the proactive approach to this, it's something where we can try to help, but there's no guarantee, I think is ultimately what it comes to.
And there's a couple different forms, right, that you kind of have to carve out with the way that we engage with like a cyber recovery program on our side, which is kind of a wrapper onto like a disaster recovery as a service. In most cases, there's a way that we engage there that may not have anything to do with even our infrastructure. It could be more people process governance of a program where we're actually helping them with change management, documentation, continually updating run books, but they own the infrastructure. It could be a combination too, where, hey, I've got a lot of this on-demand compute. They want to do SAN-to-SAN replication and they co-locate that piece in our data center. Like there's lots of ways you can kind of modularly put this together, kind of dependent upon what hardware, software, technologies they've already invested in and kind of want to stay with. And then we can write, automation and do orchestration over the top of those tools to kind of speed up the processes in the event of, and or able to take breaks, obviously, for digital or the forensics folks, obviously kind of that step-by-step reintroduction. But kind of original point though, that could be our on-demand infrastructure. It could be literally Azure's or AWS or customer premise data center. It doesn't really have to matter for us to get involved in that, the process discussion.
I'm curious, right? When you look at revenue and you start talking about allocating budget based on percentage of revenue, right? Companies will get into situations where they'll say, we're going to spend X% of our revenue on marketing. We're going to spend X% on R&D. We're going to spend X%. And they kind of like will take these approaches. From a resilience, from a risk mitigation, resilience, recovery standpoint, what's like a good benchmark to be in? I mean, if you're spending, let's say you've got a $20 million IT budget, right, just to keep the lights on in your organization. So you're a bigger company. Like what percentage of that actually is going into backup and recovery, risk mitigation, and should be carved out into this world?
I've never actually broken or looked through the breakdown of those specific elements. Usually like IT spend though, when you start to get in the mid to enterprise space is like 1% overall. But I haven't looked into any kind of breakdown of the individual components beyond that.
It's kind of interesting to think about though, right?
Yeah.
Like you kind of, because insurance is easy, it's the same thing. It's usually like a percentage of revenue. You kind of get into like, what's your risk profile and can you push the number up or down and what are you actually doing? And you get into these kind of like rules of thumb. Mac, you mentioned a really interesting evolution here, which is like companies that are either completely on-prem and want to do things themselves or that are already investing in AWS, Azure, whatever cloud platform they actually are on. You get into this conversation of like, oh, we're safe, or we're already in the cloud. We should do everything on the cloud. Like we're on the cloud, we're secure, everything's great. No, really, it's not. Please. There's a question here I want to ask, which is how do companies end up finding you? And, this company had already found you. Like they didn't come to you because they had the event. They were with you before they had the event, and they had a very long ultimate recovery, rebuilding their entire platform over, spending almost a year of like really going through system by system. I mean, that's a big thing, but like 72 hours being back and up and running and servicing your customers. I mean, that's a fantastic story. Anybody who's upset about that, it's like, no, we were only down for 3 days. Like this is incredible. Kudos, right? How do they find you? How do they come to you? What pushed them into that?
What's funny is I kind of thought you might ask me that question, and there's no really good answers to it because I did a little research on this to where I'm tracking how long have these guys been a customer and when did this cyber event actually happen. And I looked through like 4 or 5 different, customer profiles, and they became a customer in 2007. And this incident happened in 2020. I have no clue what happened in 2006 that drove them to me. But there's a lot of other cases. They started with us in 2012, and in 2024, they had an incident. What I will say is, like in the last few years specifically, a lot of our conversations, and again, we've spent a lot of time and acquired a lot of companies in the data protection, replication, recovery space, production infrastructure, obviously with Broadcom's a different conversation, but we went through all of that on a global scale. But all that being said is we have about 6,000-ish customers across the world. Both trends that we've recognized internally and where new opportunities are coming from are typically related around insurance, like cyber liability insurance and like kind of forced maturation. We talked about it a little bit earlier where, that's still a relatively new industry and they're still working out the actuarial realities. 20% a year is not a unheard of increase to spend on those premiums, but oftentimes it's even more than that. And maybe you're not insurable at all. So for a couple examples where we actually work with some insurance companies and the brokers themselves will say, here's a 16 questionnaire. Before I take you to market, you have to fill this out and help us figure out where you are. Because, when we go to the underwriting process, that you're too big of a risk, or I guess the price, or whenever they're creating that premium or evaluating your risk, you're either going to be insurable or you might be better off self-insuring because your premiums are going to be just off the charts. So they might take that questionnaire and say, hey, you're weak in, version 2, 3, 4. A lot of the weakness is in the preparation for the specific cyber use case. So historically, people bought like backup and ER, even technology, but they bought solutions around that. It was for fire, flood, natural disaster, human error. The weakness in the market right now, because there's just not a lot of really people or resources that have the reps in that response to be effective and package a solution around that. So we get involved heavily, and that's where Brian really comes in, is 4 out of maybe 5 out of 10 actions, they're going to be pre-game planning, documentation, change management related. That's the part that's missing. It's the manufacturing customer that comes to us from an insurance broker that says, we don't even have a BC plan. So can you help us write the policies and procedures that should be in place, even down to the paper processes to function in the event of IT system downtime.
Yeah, but by the way, you need to have this on paper, because if you don't,
Yeah.
like you're
Right.
like, whoops, do you have a binder with phone numbers in it?
Yeah.
Can you call people?
But yeah,
How?
so insurance and then regulatory, one of my favorite stories in the last couple of years would be a government contractor that happens to take a lot of pictures of license plates along I-95. But they were just a recovery customer of ours, in the state came back and said, hey, we need all your backups immutable. And like, what does that mean? And they said, okay, everything's got to be immutable. And here's my requirements, like 1.4 petabytes worth of immutable storage that they didn't have. Obviously, that's an enormous financial impact to a contractor. That's like, if I'm going to retain my contract, I've got to, solve for this. But that's super expensive. And the mitigation was, we were coming in and doing what Brian mentioned earlier, was an assessment around vital data assets. Is what does the regulation or the requirement actually say? What data is actually useful that falls into this category? And it went from 1.4 petabytes down to about 400 terabytes. So pretty meaningful reduction in spend just off of looking at the data appropriately. But
Customer coming to you in 2006, 2007 was probably driven like, we don't want to be in the tape game anymore.
Yeah.
And they were looking for solutions that were not tape based, or they were looking at business continuity. Because if you've done any business continuity disaster recovery planning, you start looking into, it becomes very quickly, it's like, how are you backing up data? And then what are you recovering it to? And what's your recovery action strategy? And so I would guess that profile really came from that place. But, nowadays, we talk about there's a modernization of companies and IT platforms, and it's pushed into SaaS applications, it's pushed into cloud. It's changed the profile a lot. Now, if you're a really old business that you have this legacy on-prem environment, then you're still backing up this legacy on-prem environment. That customer is becoming less and less common. People are going, whether they started as cloud native or whether they've figured out some sort of virtualization, migration, quasi-cloud platform now, like the baby cloud step, that the profiles changed a lot. So, I mean, how has that changed the game and the way you look at things? And Brian, you were talking about this a little bit earlier, right? Like, can you back up your SaaS application? Is there a way for you to export data?
Yeah.
People, having a conversation with somebody about backing up your Microsoft 365 environment, when people look at, and they're like, well, no, I'm already in 365. I don't need to back. I mean, how has that conversation really changed?
Yeah, so I think the very first thing, Max, is awareness. So I think the awareness is finally going up a little bit about, these are things that we do have to worry about. We haven't transferred all the risk to the third party. So it's starting to look at things like, what am I actually covered for as far as recovery scenarios? I think it's going to probably be two sides of things. Part of it's going to be, what can we do to put ourselves in a better position? So finding a way to create the backups, or maybe pressuring your SaaS provider to give you the ability to do something like that. I think the other side too is, as more organizations are becoming aware of this now, some of the questions they're going to start pushing to these SaaS providers will be very to the point. Am I covered for cyber scenario? Are you protecting my data? If not, then how are you allowing me to protect my data? And I think over time, I think we're going to start to see a shift in that either the SaaS providers are going to have to increase their capabilities. We're not right now, we might be working with the companies that are getting the SaaS. The focus may shift to the SaaS providers themselves to say, okay, the expectation now for SaaS provider is, you need to do a little bit more. Either give us the capability to protect our data, or you're going to have to start working that into your contracts, where whether it's a buy-up or whatever it is, to give the capability that you are going to cover us for the cyber type scenario. So I think there's a couple different ways that could go, but it's something that I think, number one, awareness is going to help push some type of a fix for this. So whether, again, it's allowing us the capability to do more to protect ourselves, or having the SaaS providers offer more capabilities. So again, it might be a buy-up. I know Microsoft was big on that buy-up for a little bit there. I just think ultimately just awareness. There's still a lot of organizations that are lacking that awareness, but I think it's starting to become something that's coming to light. So with a little bit more push against those SaaS providers, you're going to see a shift, whether again, it's allowing you to do more, or them stepping up and taking more responsibility and ownership of that scenario.
Do you think this is going to drive an evolution within the IT departments themselves of being more GRC aware and, let's say, ownership of that? Or is this something that is going to be maintained and pushed outside of the IT teams, where you have, whether it's procurement or legal GRC overlay that says, what's our risk across these different platforms?
Yeah, I think it's going to be more of a shared responsibility moving forward. So just like we see with dealing with a cyber event, it's not just a security problem. It's not just a recovery team problem. It's not just a business continuity problem. It's not just a crisis management problem. It's not just, a legal problem. It's really all those teams have to work together. So I think the same will apply moving forward when we start to look at these different applications or service offerings or SaaS providers. There's a lot of different groups that probably should have input on. We should be looking, are they implementing the right security controls? Are they implementing the right recovery controls? Are they giving us the capability to do some type of business continuity workarounds? Are they covered with insurance? So if they cause us a business interruption, do they have an adequate level of insurance to cover our business impacts as well? So there's a lot of pieces to it. So I think there's going to be a lot more coordination between different teams moving forward, just like you would if you actually were to experience a ransomware type event internally.
We're actually, if you just look at the role inside of like a disaster recovery coordinator on our side, if we're delivering like one of these managed recovery program type services, and that role exists in there to basically liaise with cybersecurity, IT, legal executives, having some cross-functional collaboration skills, technical fluency, crisis management. I mean, it's an important role, and because of that shared responsibility, and there's a lot more people involved than used to be.
Not to like overly simplify this, but you're in the backup and recovery like animal, right? Like this is obviously you think it's very invaluable for companies to have an adequate backup and recovery plans and strategies, right? This is what you offer to market at a core level. From this estate and this portfolio, right? Like we get back into this earlier question, offensive, defensive, right? Then you go into, you've got all these different tools that you need to check the box on, right? And then you say, okay, do you have an IR retainer? Have you done tabletop exercises? Are you coordinating? Are you doing test restores? Your validation of your backup. These are all hugely valuable, important things to do. But then you start talking about resources, whether it's time or people or budget. Where do you invest and how do you maintain this? And in the case, I've just been thinking about this as we go back and forth a little bit of it's absolutely critical that you have an appropriate resilience plan in place. You have your critical applications and you have a way to protect them and back them up and recover them. But then you also need to have this other piece of the puzzle, which is what's your forensics and incident response umbrella over that? And are you finding, is this now becoming more and more of a coordinated in tandem exercise, or where you guys are working with a forensics and IR company in advance of an event with a customer and you're actually working through these conversations? Or is this still like, hey, we're in this silo and we're doing this for this company and we're doing a good job for them, and then we get a call, oh shoot, something's happened and we have a conference bridge that gets turned on?
Yeah, I can tell you that we coordinate and have partnerships with incident response companies. A lot of times, if a customer's already got their own, it's not a deal killer, but we have those resources to pull from and definitely advise and hope to write into their response plan some sort of incident or IR retainer type services. The other piece of that is just continually iterating and improving on the recovery plan, right? So doing tabletop exercises with our customers as part of the service. Maybe it's one, maybe it's two a year, and planning for more common use cases and how do you respond to this, if that, and then writing that into the plan. So it's continuous improvement is a key element. We don't always get to do that with the incident response team, but we definitely see the value in them and bake it in if we can.
Yeah, I think, Max, we are starting to work more with them, coordinating things like tabletops, like you mentioned. We do different flavors of tabletops, depending on what the focus is. We're just looking for kind of how we initially respond. So maybe it's the executive input, or is the recovery teams that we're focused on? Do they know how to do the clean room? Do they know how to find the clean data recovery point? So we are actually starting to do tabletops with our IR firm as well, our partner on that. So again, depending on what the organization wants to kind of practice or focus on or be aware of, there's different ways these tabletops can be done now to achieve different goals. Just because you said there's so many different players, so many different pieces, and there's different expertise that not everyone's going to have on all those different areas. So especially around things like ransom negotiation, how that works, or buying ourselves time while we figure out do we actually have something to recover. Those where those IR firms really can play a huge role. You can't replace their experience. We could have someone on staff identified as taking that role, but if they don't have that experience of doing that day in and day out, it's a really tough spot to put them in. And these ransom gangs and threat actors, they apply maximum pressure. So, if they have a list, they'll start calling your employees. Your company doesn't care about you. They don't want to pay the ransom. They'd rather you go out of business and be jobless. It's all the pressure they can apply. Get that idea of the clock running in your head constantly. It's just pressure, pressure, pressure.
Well, people forget they're professionals and they've honed their craft here. Ransom negotiations, right? It's not just about getting your data back. It's about preventing your data from being disclosed. I mean, That's also a scary thing, right? Like these decisions spiral out very quickly. You mentioned RPO a lot, and like this RPO RTO kind of concept, when you look at it from the surface, is like, of course, I want it like instantaneously, and I want it like right now, right? Why wouldn't I? With falling dwell times, has that changed policies across your customer base of like how long they're maintaining data and what their actual rotation schedules look like, or
Yeah, Max, I think that's a big
retention?
miss for a lot of organizations right now. They're not putting a lot of thought into those retention periods. I'm seeing a lot that are putting just kind of blanket policies on this immutable data or their cyber data vault data. I just ran into one a couple weeks ago. They just did a blanket policy 7 days. Said, okay, well, that's good if you catch it within the 7 days, but otherwise you have nothing. You have just hope that you have some older backup that wasn't immutable, that or outside of the vault, that is usable and clean. So again, I can't put enough emphasis on that upfront, understanding your data. So it's not even just understanding what's important, but also retention periods are huge too. Because again, it's going to vary from system to system. A good example is warehouse inventory system. That could be to day-to-day business. You obviously need to know what's in the warehouse. We did that major global retailer that came back as a system that would potentially be a vital data asset. But when we had the conversation about, okay, what's the actual value of this data over time? If I came back and gave you something that was a year old, would that be of any value to you? So for some applications that were VDAs, they said, yeah, I'll take whatever I can get because I need all that data.
Mm-hmm.
We go to the warehouse management team and they say, no, I don't want that. After 3 days, I have to recount everything in the warehouse anyway. Just throw it out. There's no point in that. So
Mm-hmm.
you really have to understand the data and the value of it. And the retention periods is a huge piece because if you're applying just a blanket statement or policy, it could be too short, too long. It's not a one size fits all on this. So you really have to figure out that value of the data over time.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you a question, and I know the answer is it depends. So I'm gonna try to color it a little bit.
I am a consultant, so
Yeah, no, I'm gonna try to color it a little bit here and give you a little more specificity. You're in the business of helping companies figure this out,
right.
so you've got a lot of experience. You do this a lot. You talk with a lot of different people. The big X factor becomes how many applications they actually have and where their data actually sits. So you can't really, nope, you're not gonna. I'd be willing to bet that people that have not been through this exercise actually do not know the answer to that question, right? Because it's more than people would expect.
Yeah.
So you can't quantify that until you know, like, okay, we have 100 applications, we have 1,000 applications, we have 5. On an application basis, though, like how long does that process really take you to go through this evaluation, saying, okay, we've identified this application, and now we know where it runs and where it sits and how much data it has and how much data changes a day, and like what's that look back window, like you said in the warehouse, like past 3 days, it's pointless, right? How long does that take you to run that exercise through with a customer on an application basis?
Yeah, so there's different ways we can approach. So here's comes the it depends.
Yeah.
So, if you just want just bare minimal knowledge on something, it can be a pretty quick process. If we just say, okay, we're just going to take the application. Okay, let's understand if I lost, say, the last 6 months of data, what would that mean as far as impact? Okay, let's get into our questions then about, resilience around that. You
Mm-hmm.
know, do we have the ability to rebuild that from other systems? Can we recreate that? What's the percentage we could recreate or rebuild if we did a combination of both? So you can get a kind of a feel for it. And we could say, okay, let's get the value of this data over time. Is this something where if, it was 6 months old, is it still valuable? So you can kind of quickly kind of just do that and say, okay, we're done with that application. Then there's the other extreme where you could really do a deep dive. If we were to do a full BDA assessment, there's a whole series of questions we go through, similar to a BIA, but they're more focused around the idea of risk factors and would they be realized if the data on this system was lost. And then we get into the whole conversation about the value of data over time, try to determine exactly when is that no longer of any value. Is it a year? Is it 6 months? Or is it
Mm-hmm.
3 days for the warehouse management team? Okay, so we got those figured out. So now we know application B is going to be our target. That's the VDA. Do we want to protect the whole ecosystem, the work stream? So do we protect applications A and C also with that? So you get into conversation around that. Okay, we decide we're just going to protect application B. Okay, you could just literally just protect all the components of that, but you're probably overspending because within that ecosystem of application B, it may have 100 servers, different configs, different items. I don't necessarily need to protect all 100 items within that application's ecosystem. It might only be 5 out of the 100. So you can really narrow in the scope depending on how much time you want to spend and commit to this. You can narrow that down to exactly what needs to be protected. You get into the conversation about data retention. What are we doing today as far as just from our DR perspective? Do we want to mimic that from the cyber vaulting perspective? Do we want to have some older copies in case there was longer dwell time? So you can really spend a lot of time on this. So
How do you
it's kind of the two sides.
How do you scope this process with a company? I mean, because this isn't like nobody's going to give you an unlimited blank check to go spend 10 years digging through their applications. And I mean, so how do you determine a scope and come back and say, here's your financial target in order for us to do this work for you? Go and come back and give you recommendations, or at least give you enough information that you can make a decision with that's actually like coming from a place of information as opposed to just guessing.
Yeah, so I think we have a very open conversation right at the front end. This is the different ways we could try to do it. Obviously, that second way I talked about is a much deeper dive, much more expensive engagement where you get return on investment over time because you're spending less on storage, things like that. But if you just want indicators, we have the conversation about we could do something like an AIA or a BIA with some just additional questions. So the way we typically classify it then is we would say, okay, this application is a vital data asset candidate. You probably should do a little bit more digging into this one on your end with your resources to see exactly what that means. It can just kind of be a bit of an add-on to a BIA or an AIA type of engagement. So minimal additional cost to what you would have spent to just go through the process anyway. But it's just going to give you an indicator that this is probably something we should take a deeper look at versus that full-fledged deep dive into all your data to really give you this is exactly what you need to protect out of this application, these 5 servers. This is what the retention periods look like. Don't waste your money retaining stuff longer than this because it's not a value. So really, it just depends on how far you want to go with it. So for some of the small organizations, we typically find it's just the indicator. Just tell me the ones that you think potentially are going to be the targets, and then we'll figure out how we want to protect those. Versus some of those more global organizations, like that global retailer we did, wanted very specifics. The one Mac talked about, the organization that was taking the toll pictures for that authority, needed it more of a deep dive because this additional spend was going to kill them. I mean, it just unplanned for cost per month to try to maintain that just wasn't realistic. So how can we get that down to a more manageable number? So for them, some initial more investment on the front end, give them long-term return on that. So it just, you got to find that right balance. It's going to be a balancing act with all of these. So just depending on your organization, what do we look like? Do we have 12 applications versus we have the 3,000 applications? And which ones do we want to do the deep dive on? So it's going to be different flavors.
And if the application went away, how do you go back to a paper process?
Can you? Can you even? We find for some, there is nothing else. There's no way to rebuild. There's no way to recreate. So if that becomes the target, you're done. If that's your primary system for running your business, you're out of business. There really is no coming back from it. So you really need to understand that. So that front end of understanding your data is really probably one of the most important pieces.
Circling back to the beginning, though, the initial question, though, as far as like scoping and a blank check, it is not common that someone says you have a blank check to go run this. So we do
wish it was, but that's not the case.
Estimated number of hours based off of that conversation. So we at least have some expectation. And if the scope changes, then obviously we address that. But it's an hourly estimate.
Companies aren't giving unlimited resources to their backup and recovery plans, like sacrilege.
More on cyber than some other things. So
I could actually probably keep going on this for a while, but anything that we've not touched on, you think we should? I mean, besides like, hey, people, if you're watching this, please back up your data and test that your backup, right? I was going to make that blanket disclaimer.
I think, as far as the backups, it seems like everybody's at this point is latched on to the immutable concept. So I think, the point of emphasis around that part is there's more than just immutable. We talked about retention periods. We've talked about making the data unreachable. The data should be encrypted. You should have anomaly scanning. So, detection is a key piece of all of this. So whether it's detection that someone's gotten into your environment or detection that your backups are no good. If you don't have that, you're making an assumption that we've got good backups. If we wait until time of incident where, okay, they've now flipped the switch and we have nothing to restore from, we have all this garbage backups, what do? I think the other side too, Max, is the business continuity side. It's sometimes overlooked because it's a very technology-focused conversation. We're talking immutable backups. We're talking executing clean data, clean rooms. The business continuity can buy you time. So understanding what the workarounds are if the application or certain systems are not available, are there ways we can continue the process? I think you talked about, that conference room with all the paper. It's not going to be fun. It's not going to be pleasant, but it's all about, keeping the business moving. It's surviving, really. You're in survival mode at that point. So there's that idea of keeping the business moving, but also on the flip side, you're most likely going to have some extent of data loss if you get into one of these situations. So this is where the business can step up and help out potentially to fill some of those gaps. So we talked about they might have a good understanding of where the data is going to or where they're getting similar data from other systems just from their day-to-day use of these applications. They also might be aware of ways to manually recreate that. So they're running certain reports, or we have a call center that's taking physical notes on things, or we have people just from memory, remembering certain things. There's also the idea of things you might never do. The business knows we send a copy of this contract to our customers. We would never, under normal DR situation, reach out to our customers and say, "Can you send us a copy of our contract?" But in a situation with this, if you lost all your data, that might be a step you'll take. It's going to be embarrassing, but it comes down to, do you want to just survive or not?
What I'm hearing that I want to reiterate is this is not an IT problem. This is a business problem.
You got it.
And you have to approach it as a business problem, and your life will be better. And by the way, please back up and test your backups and validate that your backups are good.
I think that's a very fair statement.
Yeah. I will say, though, too, Brian is definitely the doer with lots of experience in creating these programs. I'm more of a concept guy. So from a simplistic standpoint, when I first got exposed to the whole concept of the cyber incident recovery program, my question to one of the architects was, beyond recovery time, focus with speed for the more legacy use cases for backup and D, what are the things that most organizations miss when it comes to the cyber use case and how to leverage these tools? And it was right off the cuff. He said the 3 C's, it's credentials, configs, and clean room. I think that's fascinating. If you kind of dig into it, credentials, if you've got to go to a historical backup copy and you don't have historical credentials to access that backup, you end up in a place where you're effectively hacking yourself, trying to get access to that data. With configs, especially in a large organization, who's capturing the images or metadata in that environment? If a developer's made 1,000 changes since the last time that you've accessed this data, bringing that data up into a different environment may cause a slowdown, in all likelihood will cause a slowdown. So are you capturing that metadata and have the ability to kind of translate that and recover in that environment? And then lastly, the clean room, which we've talked pretty extensively about, of having that network isolated, preferably on-demand compute, to give your incident responders a little more room to run multiple copies and identify that clean data faster. So
Amazing. Guys, thank you very much.
Yes.
I think some people think this is a really boring topic. I don't. And please back up and test your backups.
Yes.
Got it.
Very good.